Hi everybody. Today we're going to start our new unit, and today we are going to specifically talk about energy. We're going to be going over energy, enzymes, and the digestive system. So here you see a few forms of energy. You see light, and then you see this type of energy in the middle. This is called ATP. ATP is how our cells use energy. So that's a very important type of energy. So how is energy found in living things? Well, first of all, there's kinetic energy. Kinetic energy is the energy due to movement. So think about something moving down a hill or falling, that is kinetic. Thermal energy, like the fire that my picture is kind of covering up there, that is the energy of heat. Potential energy, the energy is stored. You can see this kid here has pulled back the slingshot, but nothing is moving. So no energy is actually being used, but there's energy there that could be used. That's potential. And then we have chemical potential, a specific type of potential energy where the energy is stored not from pulling back a slingshot, but it is stored in the bonds that make up food, like the carbs that make up this bread and the fats that make up the meat. Those bonds are going to store energy that can be used later, and that's how we get energy. So first of all, let's do a question. What is the difference between kinetic and potential energy? All right, and fill that out on the question on the side. Okay, one thing that energy does is it gets transferred from one form to another. We can't really get rid of energy, but we can change how energy is, what form it's in. Chemical potential energy can be transformed into kinetic and into heat. So we actually see that here. We see glucose. So glucose is a biomolecule, and in these bonds, we have lots of energy stored up. And when we combine glucose with oxygen, we can release a bunch of energy as ATP. So we can change the form of the energy hidden in glucose, those calories that we eat. That's energy that's stored, and we can use those calories, we can use that stored energy to make ATP. So chemical potential energy is found in the bonds of high energy molecules. Sugary and fatty things have lots of energy. That is why sugary and fatty things are bad for us, because we rarely are able to use as much energy as we take in if we eat very sugary and very fatty things. So what types of molecules tend to have bonds that store lots of energy? Think about this. This should be review from a last chapter, and type your answer in. All right, I'm going to move on. So chemical potential energy is found in the bonds of carbs, like glucose and starch, and fats. And we see that happening here. We see a glucose molecule, the energy in those bonds reacting with oxygen. It's going to burn, not really burn in our bodies, but it's going to do something similar to burning to produce water and carbon dioxide, and a bunch of energy would come out as a result. Chemical reactions can use energy, or they can release energy. Here we have an example of a reaction. Here are the reactants. Here are the products. The products are down here. This is potential energy. So on the y-axis, this is potential energy. I'll even put that in, PE, potential energy. So which has more potential energy? The reactants do. Which has less potential energy? The products do. So when this reaction happens, notice the difference. The reactants had a bunch of potential energy right there in the middle. The products have less. So energy has left the reaction and gone out into the surrounding. That is called an exothermic reaction. On the right, we see a graph where the reactants have a low amount of potential energy. See how low it is on the graph? Products have a medium amount of potential energy. So we have gained energy. Energy has gone into this reaction. So it was absorbed, and that is called an endothermic reaction. So endo means entering, energy is entering this reaction. So let's take a closer look at each of these types of reactions. Exothermic reactions release energy, exo, exit, and that means that more energy is found in the bonds of the reactants. So notice where they are on the graph. The reactants that I'm highlighting in red, they're about halfway through. When the reaction is over, the products have a lot less energy. So notice how much energy left. It's a particular amount from the beginning to the end. This is the amount of energy that left. And that energy went somewhere. So it was transformed into some other form. It could be heat, it could be movement, it could be ATP, it could be some other molecule, but energy left. Examples of this: fireworks exploding. When they explode, energy leaves, and you're kind of left with ash and some gases, right? And the ash and the gases don't have very much energy. So a lot of the energy left is heat and light. Burning sugar, same thing. If you were to burn a pile of sugar, a bunch of heat and light would be produced, and what you would end up with would have less energy because much of the energy was transformed and left. All right, so lecture check. Analyze the exothermic reaction graph. How much energy is released? Put your answer on the right. Well, if we look at our reactants are at 40, and we look at our products are at 20. So we lost from 40 to 20, we lost 20 kilojoules of energy. So 20 kilojoules of energy was released from this reaction. And again, that could be lost as heat, it could be lost as ATP, or it could be lost in some other way. All right, endothermic reactions means that we're going to need to absorb energy. So heat or energy is taken in. Notice the reactants don't have very much energy. The products have more energy. So this reaction had to get energy from somewhere else in order for the reaction to happen. It's endothermic. We had to bring energy in. Example, anytime we build anything, building requires energy, right? If you want to build something, it's going to require energy. So building starch and building glycogen will require an energy input. Photosynthesis, the synthesis part means building, that's building sugar. Cold packs, if you ever used a cold pack, that is a chemical reaction, and it gets colder because it is absorbing heat and bringing that into the reaction. That absorbing heat makes it colder because it's not releasing the heat. So this is energy taken in. And the big question here is, where is that energy going to come from? The energy that's taken in, where are we getting it? All right, so here we have a graph of an endothermic reaction. We can tell it's an endothermic reaction because the reactants have a low amount of energy and the products have a higher amount of energy. So like before, how much energy must be gained? Put your answer in. Well, our reactants have 100 kilojoules of energy, and our products have 300 kilojoules of energy. So if we want this reaction to happen, we have to increase by 200 kilojoules of energy. That is how much has to be brought into this reaction. All right. One example of a endothermic reaction is photosynthesis. This is when plants make sugar. So this is an energy transfer between the sun and sugar. The sunlight is going to provide energy, and it's going to then transform that energy into sugar. That is an endothermic reaction. Sunlight energy transforms into chemical potential energy of glucose. So when you think of building something bigger, when you think of a dehydration synthesis reaction, think of an endothermic reaction. Energy is going in. Meanwhile, the opposite, an exothermic reaction, would be cell respiration. So for example, we undergo cell respiration. We burn the food we eat. In this example is sugar. So with Halloween coming up, you might be eating a lot of sugar. When you burn sugar to make ATP, you are actually releasing energy. You're breaking the sugar down, and breaking it down releases energy. That is exothermic. So the energy that is stored in the bonds of glucose is going to be released as ATP. All right. Now, glucose and ATP, what is the difference exactly? Glucose is energy that can be stored. So this is good for stored energy. So we can store glucose in our body, and that's what it's good for. We can keep it for a while. But ATP is the molecule that our cells use for energy. So we actually take glucose and use it to make ATP, and ATP goes like that. ATP is very quickly used, but we can't really store ATP because everything can use it. It's not very stable. So glucose is energy that can be stored. ATP is the way our cells use energy, and ATP goes quickly. So we have to keep making ATP because it won't sit around for a while. All right, let's see if you got that. What is the difference between how the body uses glucose and ATP? Take some time to enter your answer. All right, so we're going to finish off today with a little bit about ATP, and we want to go over what is ATP. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. That tri means that there are 3 phosphates attached. ATP is our molecule for cell energy. And pretty much everything you do, from your muscles working, from digesting, from building glycogen, to thinking, to doing anything that your body does, it all requires ATP. All living things use ATP to make their cells work. Bacteria do it, prokaryotes do it, plants have to use ATP, animals have to use ATP, fungi have to use ATP, everything uses ATP. And we see a picture of ATP on the right. So here is the adenosine part, and then here is the triphosphate, 3 phosphates connected. And it's important to note, and something you should remember, is the bond that keeps that last phosphate on. That is the high energy bond. That is where most of the energy in ATP is found, right there. The bond connecting the second phosphate to the last phosphate, that is the high energy bond. That's where all the energy is. All right, so ATP is a nucleotide, and it is 3 phosphates bonded in a row. The last phosphate is what contains all that energy. Think about ATP like it's spring loaded. So imagine we were to force this spring all the way down. What would you think about that spring? That spring would be very unstable. It would be ready to pop open at any minute, right? That's ATP. ATP is spring loaded. That last phosphate is just barely hanging on, and it can very easily release that last phosphate, and that is going to be the energy to do work in our cells. All right, so how does ATP release energy? Well, when ATP loses its last phosphate, that is when the work is done. So here is ATP. Think about ATP like a fully charged battery. Lots of energy there. When that last phosphate is removed, so let's say you start moving your muscles, and that means that ATP is going to lose its last phosphate. Well, when ATP loses its last phosphate, it becomes ADP, adenosine diphosphate. That dies for 2 phosphates that are left. And then we have a free one that is now floating around. So the energy has been released, and so the battery of ATP has been drained. So ADP is like a partially filled battery, not totally filled, right? So that is how ATP gets used. When it is used up, it becomes ATP. And there is actually a cycle, so ATP can be continually recycled. We have ATP here. When it is used, it is going to become ADP. It has lost its phosphate, not much energy. And then when it is done, so over time, what can happen is when we need to make more ATP, we can eat some food, and food will help us make more ATP. So we have this entire cycle going on. ATP gets used because you need a chemical reaction to happen. We're left with low energy ADP. All right, now we have ADP and we need some more energy, so we eat food, and eating food gives us more ATP. So we keep losing the phosphate and then putting the phosphate back on. It keeps recycling. We lose the phosphate, you see that happening here. And then when we eat food, the food helps us to add that last phosphate on again. So ATP continues to be recycled. And there's a video that we're going to watch that's going to help us figure that out. All right, so lecture check. Which of the following molecules will have the most energy? Enter your answer. The most energy is going to be found in ATP. ATP is our energy molecule. All right, and finally, how can endothermic reactions happen? So remember what an endothermic reaction is. An endothermic reaction is one that requires an input of energy. But where is that energy going to happen? Where is it going to come from? That energy comes from ATP. ATP is going to be where the energy for endothermic reactions come from. So anytime you build anything, for example, if you're building glycogen, and that's an endothermic reaction, where are we getting that energy? It is coming from ATP. ATP is driving that reaction forward. And that is the key for today. So some of this stuff can be kind of tricky. Go over this, make sure you've taken notes. If you haven't, go back and make sure you've taken notes that are on the topics page. We're going to review this tomorrow, so let me know if you have any questions.